All right, great. Okay, so tonight we are going to cover again two stories here that are very well known, and they're intertwined. One of them happens in the midst of another one, right? So we kind of start the healing of Jairus's daughter, or basically saving him from death, and then we get interrupted by the woman that is suffering from the issue of blood. And then we go back to the healing of Jairus's daughter. So we've got these two that are sort of intermingled. But even though they seem like two separate stories, and they're two separate healings, they're two separate stories, there is so much that these two have in common with each other that it kind of notes us, sort of pointing those out as we go throughout this whole thing. That they have much more in common than they have differences, and I think we'll kind of see that as we get through the session tonight. So just so you know where we're at, this again, we're getting close to being done with this whole kind of mega section, which is the controversy over the king, and then we'll get into our next part five, a little bit later on. So we're really getting close here to ending this section before we get into some other stuff. But tonight we're going to cover the power over disease and death, and then in the next couple of weeks we will look at his rejection of Nazareth, and then his instructions for the mission that the disciples need to go on. And then just sort of anticipatory between section 33 and 34, I don't have it on here, but that will be a small excursus into the doctrine of hell that we will be looking at, because in number 34, we will be looking at what Jesus has to say. And he says something that is pretty impactful unless you actually have an understanding of what the doctrine of hell is. You're going to not really understand what he's talking about. So we're actually going to take a little bit of time and kind of go into that, and then that'll be sort of our basis for understanding his further warnings against hell and things like that. So we will take a little bit of an excursus there between 33 and 34, and that'll probably be 3 or 4 weeks down the road. So if you're interested in that, if you have others that haven't been participating in this series, but you think that might be really interesting, they can plop right into the middle of that when we start talking about it, and they can be there for those 3, 4, whatever, 5 weeks, however long it takes us to get through that, without having to be part of the entire series. So just kind of a heads up there. You might want to start circulating that among others that you think might be interested, but that'll be in probably 3 or 4 weeks, depending on how long it takes us to get there. Okay. Let's go ahead and cover these two stories that we have here. Now, they are again covered in all three of the synoptic gospels, and we're going to actually spend most of the time in Mark. Now, it's interesting that the situation that we talked about last week, which was the healing of the two demoniacs, the casting out of the legion of demons. Again, Mark gave a much more detailed account of that than the other two gospel writers. Normally, Mark is the truncated one. He's the one that gives the least amount of information. You typically get much more from Matthew or from Luke. But in this case, we get more from Mark again. So we're going to actually look at Mark's version, and then we will go to the other two and bring them in as we get to the different sections of this. So starting in Mark chapter 5, verse 21, it says, "And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, 'My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live.' And he went with him, and a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had had discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus, and came up behind him in the crowd, and touched his garment. For she said, 'If I touch even his garments, I will be made well.' And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, 'Who touched my garments?' And his disciples said to him, You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?' And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, 'Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease.' While he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, 'Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?' But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, 'Do not fear, only believe.' And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, 'Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping.' And they laughed at him, but he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, 'Talitha cumi,' which means, 'Little girl, I say to you, arise.' And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age, and they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and he told them to give her something to eat. All right. So that's the primary account for tonight. Now, again, the setting for this, keep in mind, this is, likely within 24 hours, maybe 36 hours, but it's within a day or so of the unpardonable sin where they refused to believe that he was the Messiah and accused him of doing his miracles on the grounds of demon possession. So we had immediately the calming of the sea issue or miracle that we had. We had the casting out of the two demoniacs last week. And then we have oops, sorry about that. And then we have tonight, we have him then going across it. So basically it says, and when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him and he's beside the sea. So what has gone on here is that Jesus was on the east side of the Sea of Galilee. He was in the area of the Gerasenes, the Gadarenes, Gerasa, and he had cast out the legion of demons from those two demoniacs. Now him and his disciples have gotten back in the boat, and they've gone across the sea, and now they're back in Jewish territory, likely in Capernaum, for this particular miracle. Now, the one thing I think is kind of interesting is that Jesus has calmed the sea. They've got over to the Gadarenes or the Gerasenes. And then he's telling his disciples, "Hey, let's get back in the boat again." Now, I don't know about you, but I think the disciples, if I was them, I probably would have still a little bit of trepidation about getting back in that boat because you got to go all the way back over the sea again. And I imagine that probably was, for some of them at least, a little bit gut wrenching to be like, "Okay, I got to get back in this." But that's what they did. They got back in the boat. They go back over here. And then what it says here is that when they got beside the sea, one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, seeing him, fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." So what we have here then is the boat lands, and one of the elders of the local synagogue, his name is Jairus, he comes and begs Jesus to come and heal his daughter, who is at the point of death. Now, remember, this is his only daughter. That's what the text makes very clear. So this young girl is very, very special to Jairus, and so he comes to Jesus. Now, when it says here, it says that he implored him earnestly. What that means is that he begged him. Just think about yourself as a parent here. Your child is on their deathbed, and you know that Jesus can actually heal. That's the reason why Jairus came to Jesus. He knew Jesus could do it. And so, but he's begging him. So imagine yourself as a parent. It's that same type of fervor that you would have when you're begging someone to do something, to give your child the medicine or whatever the case might be. It's begging, it's urging Jesus with great, much fervor. And you can just tell the Father's faith, but there's also the human side of the Father who's desperately, desperately begging Jesus to do something for his daughter to heal her, right? And in fact, the scripture makes clear that Jairus had good reason for this because, by the time Jesus actually gets to Jairus's house, she's died. So this is very, very urgent. There's not a lot of time. Now, I want you to kind of think about this because the urgency that Jairus must feel as a father, I imagine there's the anxiety is heightened because of the fact that in order for Jesus to get from where he's at along the sea to Jairus's house, he has to navigate this massive, massive crowd of people. And in the midst of this whole thing, he gets stopped and there's a delay. So if you're Jairus's father who's walking along with Jesus, you are probably thinking, you know, first of all, don't anybody distract him. It's sort of like, if you had, I don't know if you've ever been on a busy, busy freeway and there's an ambulance, you can see it behind you in your rearview mirror, and people just aren't getting over. You ever had that where people just will not move, and you're thinking to yourself, you know, guys, don't you know someone is likely a life and death situation and nobody will get out of the way? Like, I imagine that's exactly what is going on here with Jairus. Like, please just get out of the way. And yet, Jesus is not only going to be delayed by the crowds, he's also going to be delayed by this woman. So keep in mind what Jairus must be going through in this particular situation. So that's kind of the setting here. And what it says here is I want you to kind of pay attention here to Matthew chapter 9 verse 18, because in the English it doesn't come out very clearly. So a lot of yours will say that, while he was saying these things to them, behold, a ruler came in and knelt before him, saying, "My daughter just died." Now, the word that we have there for knelt is the word proskenio, which means worshipped. So, in other words, we actually should translate this that a ruler came in and worshipped before him, gave him the worth that was due to him. And remember, this man is an elder of the synagogue, which means that he was a Pharisee. It wasn't a Sadducee. The Sadducees were in charge of the temple. The Pharisees were in charge of the synagogues. And so what you have here is you have a Pharisee, and not just any Pharisee, but an elder who now is coming and worshiping Jesus. Now, I just want you to let that sink in just for a moment, because remember, this man's a Pharisee, and the Pharisaic explanation for the miracles of Christ is that Jesus does it by the power of demon possession. And yet you have a Pharisee that when push comes to shove, when he really needs a miracle to come through, he correctly evaluates who Jesus is, and in fact actually kneels before him and worships Jesus as he's asking him to do this miracle. Now, what we're going to see here going forward, and Mike, you asked this a little bit ago before we started recording, is that there is a change in how Jesus does miracles. So before the unpardonable sin, Jesus did miracles, not primarily for the benefit of the individual, but primarily for the crowds, so that they would understand who he was, that he did all these signs so that they would believe in him. So while the individual benefited, the real purpose of those miracles was to show to Israel that in fact Jesus was that promised Messiah. The other thing was that his miracles were done, for the most part, almost all of them, in public view, with many of them with massive, massive crowds around. And they also did not require faith. Now, some of them, people did exhibit faith, but he didn't require faith from people prior to that, because again, he was doing those miracles for the purpose of demonstrating to the nation who he was. So therefore, he would do miracles even if the person didn't demonstrate faith in him. What we're going to see here is that after the unpardonable sin, you're going to find out that his miracles now are done almost entirely in response to personal need. The person actually says, "I need something from you, Jesus." And Jesus then, based off of the expression of personal need, decides to do the healing. The second thing is that they're done on the basis of faith. The individuals will need to express faith in order for him to do the miracle. Not that he needs their faith to do the miracle, but that it'll be a requirement for almost all of his miracles going forward that the requester requests that a miracle in faith. The other thing that you're going to see, and you'll see this tonight, and you're going to see this continuing to go on, and we'll point this out, is that while Jesus had no problems with his miracles being done in public view before the unpardonable sin, going forward, he will intentionally do them in private. Now, not all of his miracles are done in private, like the feeding of the 5,000 and things like that. There are some that are still going to be public, but for the most part, particularly healings, they're going to be done in a very private setting. And he's actually going to intentionally make them private. It's not that they just happen to be private where he's walking along and he just meets an individual. It's that he will make them private, do the healing in private, and not do them publicly. And then many times he will then say, don't tell anybody about this. So there's an incredibly dramatic change in why he does miracles. And the reason for that is that, again, prior to the unpardonable sin, the miracles were for the nation to get them to believe. But once the nation has rejected him as the Messiah through their Pharisaic leadership, then he's not doing them for the public anymore. He's doing them for the individual based on faith. And he doesn't want them to go out and talk about all the great things he's done. Remember when the unpardonable sin happened and he started talking about it in parables, it said that he intentionally started talking in parables so that the crowds wouldn't understand what he was talking about. So that seeing they wouldn't see and hearing they wouldn't hear. And so this is another example of now this new policy being put in place where he's not going to do them publicly for the most part because the nation has gotten all the light that they need to get. And with the light they got, they are rejecting him. And so he's not going to give them more light by doing these miracles in a public way in order to be able to get the nation to respond. The nation's already under condemnation. That generation's already going to be destroyed in 70 AD. So he's not going to do anything more. So just notice going forward how many times Jesus does these miracles in private and how many times he tells the recipient not to say anything about what has happened. And unless you know about the unpardonable sin, which we spent a lot of time on, it doesn't make sense. Why would he all of a sudden do this when, why wouldn't he want people to know what he's done? Why wouldn't he want, people to evangelize who Jesus is? Why wouldn't he want the world to know that he's the Messiah? Well, we know it's because that generation is under condemnation and under a curse. And so therefore, that is why you will see this occurring. Okay, so that's what we have, right? And like I said here, the real irony of this situation is that this man is a Pharisee, and yet, when push comes to shove, he really does know that Jesus has done some stuff. Now, what this demonstrates to us is that while the Pharisees in general and the Pharisaic leadership rejected Jesus, not every Pharisee rejected Jesus. We know that Nicodemus, of course, we're not sure where he falls right now in his belief, but we do know he's edging closer to putting his faith and trust in Jesus as the Messiah. Here's another Pharisee that we have that is totally willing to buck the system, to go against what the leadership has said, and to identify that Jesus really is who he says he is and can do what he says he can do. And so he comes and he bows and worships to him. And again, that's because he's actually, unlike what Isaiah says, seeing, he actually sees. Hearing, he actually has heard, and he knows that that explanation given by the Pharisaic leadership cannot be correct. Okay, now it says that after Jairus asked Jesus to come and heal his daughter, it says and he went with them, and a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And then Luke adds in here that he had an only daughter at 12 years of age, and she was dying, and Jesus went and the people pressed around him. So both Mark and Luke tell us that these crowds were massive. And the word for thronged or pressed there is sympnego, which the usage of that is either a gardening usage or it is when it's used to people, it's used in suffocation. So when it's used in sort of a gardening way, it means to choke utterly. like weeds in the plants. If you ever do any gardening, you know exactly what it's like. You got one plant there, and if you don't do any weeding, before you know it, that plant is dead and everything just crushes it. So it's either that or it means to press upon someone to the point of suffocation. So when Jesus is walking, he is literally shoulder to shoulder, front to back, like there is no room about him. This massive crowd is pushing in on him. I've been in a few situations like that. Like a Seahawks game. Sometimes, as everyone's trying to exit and stuff like that, you get kind of stuck in this where there's just you're like barely moving and feel like cattle. It's that type of thing, but yet probably even worse, where it'd be even difficult for Jesus to move, right? Which there's a couple of implications of that. First of all, um, when Jesus asked that question about, hey, who touched me? The question's dumb. I mean, if Jesus hadn't asked it, we would have thought it's a dumb question because the disciples certainly dumb. Like, what do you mean who's touching you? Like everybody's touching you. Like the question would be like, who's not touching you? That'd be a better question, right? And also, again, it's because of these massive crowds that he can't just walk from the boat to Jairus's house and get there quickly. Like there is a massive crowd that is really slowing down that process. And so you could probably see Jairus's anxiety continuing to get greater and greater as this whole procession continues to go. Now, it says, and Jesus rose and followed him with his disciples. And behold, a woman who had suffered from a discharge of blood for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his garment. And Luke says this, that she had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and though she'd spent all of her living on physicians, she could not be healed anymore. So what we have here is we have two individuals that are desperately in need of Jesus. One is about to die. In fact, will die before Jesus gets there. The second one is a woman who has been suffering for 12 years and nothing can be done to heal her. In fact, we later find out that she's tried all the remedies from all the physicians, and through much pain and financial burden, she's actually gotten worse and not better. So she's got a chronic issue that's getting worse. It's not just a chronic issue, but it's a chronic issue that is getting worse and worse and worse all the time, completely, as we will find out, entirely debilitating to her. Now, an interesting note here is this, and I don't think that this is just a coincidence here. Notice that the woman has had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and Jairus's daughter is 12 years. So we have two individuals here that have a 12-year span of something, and they're actually going to be the reverse of each other. We have a daughter who has 12 years of life, but now is dead. We have a woman who has 12 years of death, essentially, and now is going to experience life. So it's a very interesting sort of converging of these two individuals, these two, a woman and a girl, that Jesus is going to interact with and heal. So I think there's some incredible depth here to this story, more than what we might see on the surface. Now, getting back to the woman, because she had this discharge of blood that would not stop, she was ceremonially unclean. She could not touch anybody, nor could she be touched by anybody. So she was essentially the same and no different than a leper, right? She also, though, then was restricted from participating in the daily spiritual life. That would be going to synagogue, going to the tabernacle, offering sacrifices, and just the common communal life of people in her town, right? Because she was ceremonially unclean. Now we see from Leviticus chapter 15, verses 19 through 31, we'll kind of read through in the Mosaic law what that would do to an individual. And then I just want you to put yourself in the place of this woman who's for 12 years, this has been her lot in life. She's all but dead. She's no better off than a leper who's sort of waiting to die. This is the status that this lady is in. So she has an incredible need, just like the need of Jairus's daughter. Okay. Now let's take a look here at Leviticus chapter 15. starting in verse 19 through 31. And so this is where Moses is giving the commandments around a woman who has a discharge from her body. Now, just pay attention to hear what this looks like. It says, when a woman has a discharge, and the discharge in her body is blood, she shall be in her menstrual impurity for 7 days, and whoever touches her shall be unclean until the evening. And everything on which she lies during her menstrual impurity shall be unclean. Everything also in which she sits shall be unclean. And whoever touches her bed shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean until the evening. And whoever touches anything on which she sits shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean until the evening. Whether it is the bed or anything on which he sits, when he touches it, he shall be unclean until the evening. And if any man lies with her and her menstrual impurity comes upon him, he shall be unclean 7 days, and every bed on which he lies shall be unclean. If a woman has a discharge of blood for many days, not at the time of her menstrual impurity, or if she has a discharge beyond the time of her impurity, all the days of the discharge she shall continue in uncleanness. As in the days of her impurity, she shall be unclean. Every bed on which she lies, all the days of her discharge shall be to her as the bed of her impurity. And everything on which she sits shall be unclean, as in the uncleanness of her menstrual impurity. And whoever touches these things shall be unclean, and shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean until the evening. But if she has cleansed of her discharge, she shall count for herself 7 days, and after that she shall be clean. And on the eighth day she shall take two turtle doves or two pigeons and bring them to the priest to the entrance of the tent of meeting. And the priest shall use one for sin offering and the other for burnt offering. And the priest shall make atonement for her before the Lord for her unclean discharge. Thus she shall keep the people of Israel separate from their uncleanness, lest they die in their uncleanness by defying my tabernacle that is in their midst. So, this is rough. This is rough because what is being described here in Leviticus, of course, is the normal monthly menstrual cycle that would occur, and it's giving information about how that needs to be handled, and that's it's difficult to be handling that just on a monthly basis. But because she cannot be, the discharge does not stop, that means that she continues to be unclean. And everything she touches is unclean. And everyone that touches something that she sits on or lays on is unclean. And if she's touched by someone, that person is unclean. So you can just imagine here who in their right mind is going to be a part of this woman's life. No one's going to want to touch her or be around her. She is unclean. She's as bad as a leper, except for the fact that no one's worried about passing that on to them like you would with leprosy. But other than that, she is to be treated as a leper, and that's how she would have been treated in this community. This is a woman who is desperate to be healed, desperate for the pain in her body to go away, and desperate for this seclusion that she is in, this forced seclusion, to be done with. And she's been suffering this for 12 years. So that is her state, which is why she takes extreme measures to be healed. Now, the rabbis talked a lot about this, and I could give you, page after page after page after page of where they had, where they took the Leviticus passage and then they took it to the nth degree. All these thousands and thousands of laws that they made. Well, they put all these laws on top of it. So on top of the Mosaic law that the woman had to obey and everyone else had to obey, they said all these other things that were part of what would happen to her as well. And so it made being under the Pharisaic law, it made it almost unbearable for this woman because they added on to her already pain and misery that was spelled out in the Mosaic law. And here's just a quick quote here, just to kind of show you just some of the stuff that they came up with. So it says, when a woman starts bleeding during intercourse, she is supposed to try having intercourse 3 additional times. If the bleeding continues, she should be divorced and married to some other. So, I mean, think about that. This is what the rabbi said. Hey, if this happens, guess what? Try it again 3 more times, and if it still happens, then you got to divorce, right? Because you can't saddle the man with that, right? Poor fellow to have to deal with that. So there's a divorce. Now the woman not only has a bleeding issue, but then she's going to be divorced. Now in that period of time, a woman who didn't have a husband, that was a very dire, serious situation. But this is what the rabbis are saying. Hey, in addition to all of this, divorce. And then she can marry and remarry up to 3 times. However, then she needs to examine herself with the help of another female in order to find the source of the bleeding. So, hey, look, if you get divorced the first time, you can remarry up to 3 more times. So this woman, could go through 4 husbands before it's finally like, that's it, no more. You're out of luck. As much as you might want to get married, or as much as you want to have some of the maybe security that might provide in this environment, you're done with, right? That was their Pharisaic teaching on this. And so, basically, she'd have to be examined and go through some stuff to find out, where the bleeding came from. But this is sort of their teaching here. And I don't know if this woman was married. Likely she was at least at some point. And it's certainly possible that if she went through what the Pharisees are talking about here in this particular quotation, um, that she might have been married and maybe had been married 4 times potentially, and had 4 husbands that would have divorced her because of this issue. So, in addition to her physical ailments, in addition to just society in general, it's very likely that if she had a husband, she doesn't have one anymore. And if she tried to get a husband, it's very likely that she's still not married. Like, she is in very, very desperate situation, right? Some of the other things, of course, that would happen to this lady is, she couldn't participate in the tabernacle festivities, right? She wouldn't be allowed in it. She was unclean, which meant that she wouldn't be able to offer sacrifices for sins. So just think about this. Over 12 years, yeah, you're likely going to have some sins that you need to offer sacrifice for. Guess what? You don't get to. So now not only you've got physical um, issues going on, you've got social issues going on, you've got relational issues going on with potentially a husband or husbands, but you now have a relational issue with God because you cannot make the sacrifices required for sins because you're unclean. I mean, she does not have much to look forward to. And this, in addition to that, what she has had to undergo with all of these remedies, some of them were painful medical remedies, but most of them were expensive. So not only were they probably painful, but many of them were expensive to the point where she has spent everything. So she can't be with society. She got physical pain. She, her relationship with perhaps her husband has been severed. Her relationship with God, she can't offer sacrifices for sins, and she's destitute. I mean, it doesn't get any worse for an individual than what this lady is going through. Okay. Now, both Mark and Luke, they do mention that this lady has sought medical treatment. In fact, she sought many medical treatments. She's tried everything that she can, and she spent everything on it. And of course, Mark puts this little jab in there where he says that she had suffered greatly at the hand of the physician. So it wasn't just the amount of money, and it wasn't just the constant, we'll try this, we'll try this, we'll try this, on and on and on. It's the fact that many of the things that she was asked to do cost her great, great suffering, and she lost all of her money. Okay. Now, it's likely that Luke forgot to put the fact that she suffered at the hands of the physician, because Luke himself is a physician. So that was probably just some sort of professional courtesy that he left that out. But this lady's in bad shape. I just want you to this is from the Babylonian Talmud, which is after the time of Christ, but it records things that the rabbis would have been teaching during the time of Christ and forward. And just take a look at some of the remedies that they are saying should be done if a person has hemorrhaging problems, but it's mostly, in fact, almost all of this is focused on a woman who has a discharge that will not stop. Just take a look at this. It says, and a potion of roots. What is a potion of roots? Said Rabbi Yohanan. The weight of a zuz of Alexandrian gum is brought, a zuz weight of liquid alum, and a zuz weight of garden crocus, and they are powdered together. For as a ba, a third thereof mixed with wine is efficacious that she shall not become barren. For John is two-thirds thereof mixed with beer is drunk, and he, the sufferer, then becomes impotent. So that's referring in this case to a man who has a discharge. But then it continues on. For Zabah, a third thereof mixed with wine is efficacious that she shall not become barren. But if not, let them produce 3 capiza of Persian onions, boil them in wine, make her drink it, and say to her, cease your discharge. Okay, well, if that doesn't work, what? What's next? But if not, she should be made to sit at a crossroads, hold a cup of wine in her hand, and a man comes up from behind, frightens her, and exclaims, that should say, cease your discharge. Okay, so if the first one doesn't work, you might as well just scare her to death, right? But if not, a handful of cumin, a handful of saffron, and a handful of fenugreek are brought and boiled in wine. She is made to drink of it, and they say to her, cease your discharge. But if not, let 60 pieces of sealing clay of a wine vessel be brought, and let them smear her therewith, and say to her, cease your discharge. But if not, let them take a fern, boil it in wine, smear her with it, and say to her, cease your discharge. But if not, let one take a thistle growing among Roman thorns, burn it, and gather it up in linen rags in summer and in cotton rags in winter. If not, let one dig 7 holes and burn therein a young shoot of orla, put a cup of wine into her hand, then make her rise from one hole and seat her on the next. Make her rise from that and seat her on the following, and so on. And at each one you should say to her, cease your discharge. So you know, they're digging these 7 holes and making this woman sit in one, hold the cup of wine. They say this to her 7 times and she moves from hole to hole. That's the supposed remedy for this. But if not, let one take fine flour, rub her from the lower half downwards, and say to her, cease your discharge. If not, let him take an ostrich egg, burn it, and wrap it in linen rags in summer and in cotton rags in winter. If not, let him broach a barrel of wine specially for her sake. And if that doesn't work, if not, let him fetch barley grain, which is found in the dung of a white mule. If she holds it one day, her discharge, will cease for 2 days. If she holds it 2 days, it will cease for 3 days. But if she holds it for 3 days, it will cease forever. Now, this last one is interesting because, first of all, you got to find an ostrich egg. And I don't think there's a lot of ostriches in that area. You got to go down into like Africa, I think, to probably find some ostriches. But you get an ostrich egg, probably very expensive. That's the first one up there. And this next one here, you got to find a piece of barley grain, which is growing in the dung of a white mule. So you got to find a white mule, then you got to find dung, and in the dung there has to be this barley that's growing up out of this, and then she's got to take this thing and she's got to hold on to it for 1, 2, or 3 days. This is just a small portion of all the things that they wrote about how to deal with this issue of blood. But you can see that this lady has probably done all of this stuff. And none of it's worked. She's suffered greatly. She's paid a ton of money for it. And she's in worse shape than she was when she started. So that's her desperation right now. She knows that Jesus is going to be the only one because there's nothing left. Everything that could be shown as a remedy, she's tried, and nothing has worked. Now, normally when the doctors would, or doctors or the Pharisees in this case, would give her these remedies after they've taken the remedy, the person is told, arise from your flux is what she is told. Now, Jesus uses that same formula with Jairus's daughter, right? So he does use a very similar, formula that the Pharisees would use when performing a remedy. However, he doesn't use it on this woman that's suffering with the issue of blood because before he can even do anything, she's touched his garment, and as soon as she touches the garment, she is healed. So there's no need for this sort of formulaic saying to be rendered in her case. All right. Now, here's what she has said. She is this woman. She suffered from this discharge. She touches the fringe of his garment. Again, the fringe of his garment is on his robe. According to the Mosaic law, the Jews were required to put the tassels on each corner. They had these tassels that they would put on there. In fact, you can still see it to this day if you see Orthodox Jews. They'll have those tassels on the four corners of their garments. So it's the tassel of the garment that, in fact, is what she touches. Now, notice to herself here in Matthew's account, she said to herself, if I only touch his garment, I will be made well. All right. Um, that's an incredible amount of faith because normally the healings are done when someone touches somebody else and heals them. There's a touch element, and many times Jesus, in fact, does touch to do the healing. But notice that this woman, very much like the Roman centurion who said, hey, look, Jesus, you don't even need to bother coming. I know that you don't need to do that. You can heal from a distance. All you have to do is say it's done, and it's done. This woman has a very similar type of faith. I don't even need him to notice I'm there. I don't need him to do anything. All I need to do is if I just touch his garment, that's all it's going to take. Like that's an incredible amount of faith for someone who's gone through it. Because she could have said, you know what, I'm going to make sure that I get healed. And she could have come up there and flung herself on Jesus and grabbed onto him and said, I'm not going to let you go until you heal me, something like that. But she realizes that all she has to do is just touch his garments and she'll be healed, right? Now, it says here that she had heard about uh, what Jesus had done, right? So she's heard the reports about him. So again, this is an example of faith. She's not just, you randomly doing something. She knows who Jesus is. She's heard the reports about him, and she is confident in her faith that he, in fact, can do that, right? Now, the other reason why she may not have touched him and only touched his clothing was because of the Mosaic restrictions, right? Because of those restrictions, she cannot touch someone without making them unclean, right? So that's likely where that's at. And so it would have, if she had touched him or spoke to him and he had turned around to heal her, it would have pointed out her public situation in an embarrassing fashion. But it also, if she had touched him, it could have and likely would have exposed her to ridicule and retribution, very similar to what would happen if a leper touched someone when they're obviously not supposed to. There could have been some retribution. So it's possible that her touching the garment that is because of the fact that she doesn't want to make him unclean. She doesn't want to touch him. She doesn't want to draw any attention to herself. In fact, from the text, it looks like once she does this and she's healed, she sort of pulls back into the crowd, and then Jesus has to sort of pull her back to him so that they can have this discussion. Okay, now it says that when the woman touched his garment, her bleeding stopped immediately. And in the Greek, it says that she, in the English, it's going to say like she felt or she kind of physically knew it. But in the Greek, it says that she knew. And this is the Greek word gnosko, which means to know something really experientially. It's the same kind of word that we use for gnosis for knowledge. So this is something that she knew because she actually experienced it. She could feel the immediate physical change happening in her body. Now, you're going to see here throughout the rest of this section here that the word for immediately, euthys, right? That Greek word, immediately used over and over again. I just want you to pay attention to that because as soon as she touches him, immediately she's healed. As soon as Jesus is touched or his hem is touched, he immediately knows that the power has gone out from him. And then we'll see when Jesus raises Jairus' daughter from the dead, it's immediate. So this word here, this Greek word, is meant to tell us, meant to sort of emphasize this idea of spontaneously. This thing just happens. It's immediate without any kind of progression of sickness coming into some sort of health, or slowly waking up from the death state and in a coma, whatever else. Like, it's immediate from death to life, from sickness and to health. And it goes on to say that Jesus himself, Euthys, immediately knew in himself, epigenosko, and that word epigenosko is the word which means your sort of self-knowledge, like how we know something about ourselves. It's something deep, that we know something intuitively about who we are, right? It's sort of this idea of self-knowledge, full knowledge of who we are. And so in the Greek there, it says that Jesus knew experientially that power had gone out from him, right? And in the Greek, it should be more literally stated, power from him, or on account of who he is, had gone out, right? Because of him being who he was, power had gone out. Now, this kind of raises a couple, like a question here, and people ask this question, and Bible commentators will sort of differ on this, although most of them, in fact, I wouldn't say all of them, but the vast majority of them will align with view number two. But here's the question: did Jesus know that someone had been healed? Did he know that the power had gone out immediately, or was it afterwards? Right? Did he know what had happened to him immediately, and who had done it to him, who had touched him, or does he only find out afterwards? Right? So the first view is that, God the Father is the one that heals the woman, and Jesus really isn't aware of it until, after the healing has occurred. The second one is that Jesus knows as soon as he's touched, that who it is that's touching him and what her faith is, and he is the one that sends his healing power into her. So she's healed through the power of Jesus, versus the view number one, which is God does it and Jesus just finds out, right? And I don't think view number one is correct. Um, there's also three things that we know from the text here that Jesus immediately knows. First of all, he knows that a healing has occurred. Now think about that. If someone's just touching your clothing, why would you even think anything has occurred, right? That wouldn't make any sense. If someone is touching or tugging on your clothing, there's no way that anyone would logically conclude that a healing has occurred, right? It's also, he knows how the healing has occurred, and that is by this lady touching his tassel. So he knows exactly what it is, because he asked the question, who's touched my clothes? Not who's touched me, but who's touched my clothes, knowing that, which indicates again that he knows that a miracle has occurred, and he knows how the miracle has happened. And he also, because of what he says to the woman, he knows that that healing touch was done because of her faith. So the individual that has touched him is doing it because of faith, not because he's got magic clothes or some other kind of weird thing, but he knows that that healing has been performed on her because of her faith. So those are three things that Jesus immediately knows at this point. Now, you might be asking the question, if Jesus knows what has happened, and if he knows who did it, why does he ask the question? Who touched my clothes? Why would he ask that if Jesus already knows who in fact has done this and what has actually occurred? Well, view number one is he didn't know, right? He didn't know who had done it. All he knew is that power had gone out of him. And so he turned around and he's like searching through the crowd, and he's looking, and he's like, I know someone's touched me and I don't know who that is. Well, that doesn't actually match up or line up with what we know about Jesus from other passages. The second view, which I think is the correct one here, is that he wanted to do a couple things. First of all, he wanted to make sure that the woman gets drawn out because she intended to do this healing incognito. She intended to do this healing, hoping I'm pretty sure that Jesus himself wouldn't even know. If I just touch his clothing, that's it. That's all it takes. I don't even need him to even know that something has happened. And so this is a way for him to draw her out so that her faith can be rewarded, right? He wants to establish a relationship with her. He doesn't want this to be some sort of a distant thing. He wants this to be an intimate thing between him and her. And so he intentionally is going to ask the question so that she'll be forced to be drawn out of the crowd from which she has receded back into in order to, confess to what she has done. But the second reason is for the disciples, because it's the disciples that respond to Jesus and say, like, what are you talking about, Jesus? Don't you know? Everybody's touching you. What kind of a question is that, Jesus? Like, that's a dumb, dumb question. So the question, I think primarily, yes, it's for the woman, so that she'll be sort of forced to come out and acknowledge what's been done and he can commend her faith. But I think primarily this is done for the disciples, right? Because no one other than the woman and other than Jesus know that anything's been done. At this point, no one knows. And so he needs to make this clear to his disciples that something has in fact occurred. And the way to do that is to ask a question. And that's what Jesus typically does with his disciples. Instead of telling them something, he'll ask them questions, make them think about it, and then he will provide the answer. So in this case, he asked that question, who touched my clothes? Okay. Now, again, from the disciples' point of view, this is a dumb question because, of course, the crowd's pressing on him. Everybody's touching him. I mean, it doesn't even make sense for Jesus to ask the question. And of course, they didn't know at this point that any kind of miracle had occurred. So, what this shows, and I think this is kind of important, is that obviously Jesus is being touched by many people. His clothes are being touched. But it's his supernatural ability. Just think about Jesus here, supernatural ability to distinguish between the hundreds or thousands of touches that are going on between this journey from the sea to Jairus' house and the touch of the one person that's important. He focuses in on the person that needs his help, the person that needs his touch, and the person that is exhibiting faith. He can distinguish that touch from the rest of the crowd. Like, this is who Jesus is. He has the ability to be able to know who at this right moment needs a touch from him. And he can do the same thing today. Like, this is his ability to know tonight who needs him, who needs his touch, who needs to be healed, who needs to be brought back into right relationship with him. And so it's this unique ability for him to distinguish that touch, the person in need, the person with faith, and to meet that specific touch against all the rest of the things that are going on. Now, it says here that once the woman has touched him, like, she's immediately healed and she knows that she has been healed. And so, but she sort of crept back a little bit into the crowd. And it says that Jesus kept looking around. Now, the Greek word that is used there, it says it means to look penetratingly at the crowd. So he's looking, but probably more than just looking at the crowd, he's looking right at her. So the reason for her coming out of the crowd is that his gaze has become fixed on her. Who touched me? And he's, boom, just zeroed in on this lady. And people are kind of looking at each other. I can imagine, I don't know if this happened because it's not in text, but I can imagine people start to maybe separate a little bit. Like, they're kind of looking at each other like, I didn't do it. I didn't do anything. Like, they're all kind of doing this. And all of a sudden the waters kind of part and he's just like looking. And here's this lady. And now she can't escape the gaze of the Savior. She cannot escape him. She must come to him when he has sought her out. And it says that she came in humility. And what's important about that is the humility is she knows that she's unworthy. She's not worthy to be healed. She's not worthy to be touched. She's not worthy of the Savior's work in her life. And she knows that. And so she comes in total humility, knowing that she's been healed, but that she did not deserve it. Like that is a proper stance that we need to have before God, is a stance of humility, and she demonstrates that in a very profound way. But it also says that she came trembling with fear, and of course we saw this, a couple weeks ago. The same Greek word, phobiomai, which is where we get phobia from, this fear, and that's to have this incredible like awe and reverence to the point of being just awestruck, completely beside yourself with what has happened. So she's come in humility, but this trembling with fear is not a fear of, that we might associate with phobia there, but it's this awe and this reverence of, I know whose presence I'm in, I know what has been done, and she's acknowledging who Jesus is, by coming to him because of what has happened. Now, notice that when she comes to Christ, notice the title he uses, and this is the only time that Jesus uses this word, this title, is with this woman. And he gives this woman, I don't know how old she is, but she's clearly not a girl. She is a woman, but he uses this term daughter. And it's a very affectionate, it's a very intimate term. It's sort of like when we are told that we can, that we can come to God, that he's our Abba Father. It's a very personal, it's a family term that he uses here. And the point about this is that he is addressing this woman who likely has not had interaction with Jesus at all because of her illness and stuff like that. He has now healed her, he's called her out, he's acknowledged her faith, and now he looks at her and says, daughter. He uses this incredibly intimate, loving, family term to describe her. And he uses that because he wants her to know she is now in a new relationship with him. He didn't say woman. He didn't use some term like that. He used daughter, which would be completely really inappropriate because obviously this is not his daughter, but he uses a term that is meant to tell us about this incredible bond now between him and this woman. I don't know what happened to her later on. I don't know, the gospel accounts don't really go there, but Jesus is really, it's incredibly touching how he is meeting the needs of this woman who has frankly left for dead, and he has now healed her and established this new relationship. Now it's also the same word that's used of Jairus's daughter. So again, we've got these two females here, a woman and a young girl, but they both have the same term that are applied to them. And I think it's really interesting that Jesus does these two miracles. And if we think about this, these two miracles are done for females who are not looked at highly during this time. And yet Christ goes out of his way to establish a relationship, to show his care and concern for women, to show that God does not treat women the way that society would treat them, that he is willing to engage with them in a way that society says, at that point at least, is not the right way. It's not how we do things around here. And yet we have these two healings happening, and Jesus using these two words to describe these individuals. Now, it's clear that one thing that Jesus wants to make clear here is that I apologize for that. I was typing too quickly. That it was the woman's faith that had healed, not some, magical effect of his clothing, right? Because he says it is your faith that has healed you. And actually, literally in the Greek, it is your faith has saved you or delivered you or freed you. Some versions might say that your faith has delivered you from this sickness. It's not just that she's physically here, but she's been delivered. It's the idea or the concept of being in a cage, of being in chains, of being bound. In this case, her being bound by this sickness and all the things that now she's bound with, whether it's physical or social or religious, that has gone on. And her faith has broken these bonds, and she's been delivered or she's been freed from that. And this incredible new life now has been given to her when she had no life to speak of at all. Now, the thing to remember here is that it's faith doesn't have to be big. We don't have to have a lot of faith. We just have to have faith. Because faith is really our confidence, not in the person who expresses it, but upon the object in whom it rests. So you can have little faith, but you can still have God meeting your needs because it's a faith that the object of faith is in the object, not in the person that has it, right? So for all of us out there that sometimes think, well, gosh, I just wish I had more faith. I just, I read these Bible characters and boy, they do all these things, and I'm just not like that. I just don't have that faith. I've given up. I've told God, look, God, I'm stopping praying about it. It's not worth it anymore. I don't think it's going to happen. We kind of feel like unless we have this type of faith over here that's going to, open, part the Red Sea, that God's not going to do it. But in fact, it is the fact that we have faith in the object, though. It's who we have faith in that matters. And in this case, both Jairus and this lady, it's the faith in Christ that actually does the work. Okay, so Jesus says, then he says, go in peace and be freed. In this case, in the Greek, it should actually be, literally be healthy. Go in peace, be healthy, live a healthy life. And what this meant to her is that this assurance was important because it could be that maybe this was a temporary stoppage. Like maybe this is going to be healing for a week, or maybe next month it won't be like this. Maybe it'll stop this month, but what happens when next month comes around and I start bleeding? Is it going to stop? Am I going to be normal, or is next month going to be the start of another 12 years? But it's this exhortation from Christ that says, no, this thing is done in your life. This thing is finished in your life. Go, be freed. The chains of this sickness have indeed been dropped from you. Now, I mentioned this kind of at the beginning, but I just want to bring this back here at this point, is that you've got these two individuals. One person has been a living dead person for 12 years. She's been hardly any better than a dead person for 12 years. Another person's been living for 12 years, and now they're dead. And we have these two individuals that are going to meet Christ with the result that they both have brand new, restored life. All right. Now let's go to the healing account here. Now make sure we're on time here. Let's go to the healing part of the account. It says, while he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, do not fear, only believe. Now, I just want you to stop just for a second here and think about that. They've just said, your daughter is dead. And Jesus says, don't fear. That is that's a very odd thing for Jesus to say, because she's dead. Why would you tell me not to fear? I can understand you telling me not to fear when I asked you originally, when she was still alive, but she's dead now. So what Jesus says here says, do not fear, only believe. Now, I think it's actually important here because what he says here is two things. Jairus, don't fear or stop fearing, right? Don't allow this message that's come, don't allow this message to then remove or rip away the faith that you have had. You started in faith, continue in faith. Don't do that, but only believe. In other words, don't fear. They've said she's dead. I need you to continue to believe. And of course, Jairus does. But that's what the exhortation of Jesus is here is don't listen to them. When they tell you it can't be done, when they tell you that there's no hope, don't listen to them. Jesus is here. He's on the job. He can get it done. And I'm telling you, don't fear, only believe. Now, it says that he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. Now, it's interesting that this will be repeated later on with Christ as well. Remember, at the Mount of Transfiguration, he again only brings Peter, James, and John up the mountain with him. The other nine disciples are left down at the bottom. And then also in Gethsemane, when he is getting ready to be arrested and to suffer crucifixion, he then takes these three as well as his confidants in Gethsemane to have sort of this inner circle. Now we really talked about this at the very beginning. I think it might have been session 1 or session 2 that we have kind of this grouping of 12, but the grouping of 12 is really broken down into like 3 groups of 4. And what we have here then is we have Jesus sort of taking these main individuals, Peter, James, and John, and bringing them as sort of a representation of his group of disciples. Okay. Now, he only allows those 3 to enter the house with them. Now, you might ask, why bring 3? Well, again, this miracle, yes, it's being done for Jairus and for Jairus's daughter, but it's also, we talked about, from the point of the unpardonable sin onward, the primary purpose of Jesus' miracles and teachings is to train up his disciples. In fact, we'll get to that when he starts talking about their mission and things like that. And so he wants to make sure that the disciple group has a witness to that. And according to the Mosaic commandment, there need to be 2 to 3 witnesses to validate a fact. So he brings 2 or 3 with him as witnesses to the fact that, yes, this girl was dead, but now she, in fact, is alive. All right, now, when Jesus comes to the house with his disciples and with Jairus, the Jewish rituals that go on during that time are already beginning. There's this incredible amount of mourning. There's the word that is used there in the scriptures is called thuribon, which means an uproar, commotion. And this isn't just people crying or kind of sitting around in the house, and comforting each other and passing around a box of Kleenex. This is an incredible, noisy, uproarious type of environment where they've got, tambourines and flutes, and they've got paid mourners that will come in and actually start the mourning process, and they're already there. They're wailing, they're crying. This is a loud, loud environment. So everyone that's coming with Jesus and the crowd is following him and all of his disciples and Jairus, when they get there, they know for a fact that this girl is dead because the process has already started. They come into this scene with the Jewish rituals in fully being done. Now, Jesus, when he enters the house, he rebukes the mourners by telling them the girl's not dead. And of course, the mourners and the friends, they ridicule Jesus. They laugh at him scornfully. The Greek word that's used there, I mean, they're just ridiculing him and scorning, like, you're stupid. Everybody, Jesus, everybody knows she's dead. How in the world can you say that she's not dead? Don't you know a dead person? All right, it's this kind of thing where they're kind of sort of taunting him and being scornful towards Christ. So Christ makes him get out. The only people allowed to go into the house is Jesus, Peter, James, and John, Jairus, and his wife. The rest of these unbelievers are, told to get out because they don't have the faith needed to be able to witness this particular healing. Okay, now how do we get by, or how do we deal with Jesus' statement that no, she's not dead, she's merely asleep? Okay. Because it's pretty clear from the end of this story that in fact the girl was dead and the fame of Jesus grew. It's really clear that in fact these professional mourners and friends and family members knew that she was dead. I mean, people at the time of Christ, they knew a dead person as well as we knew a dead person, right? They knew that this individual was dead. So what does Jesus mean then by saying that no, she's not dead, but she's merely asleep? Well, some people have said, well, what Jesus is saying here is he's describing sort of the intermediate state that she's actually dead, but instead of the spirit going, to Sheol, whatever else, the spirit sleeps. It's called, the spirit sleeps. It's not really conscious or awake after death, right? So that's kind of one thing that people have said. Um, so, is that what Jesus is actually describing here as this sort of, sleep in death? Well, it's not really supported elsewhere in the New Testament. I mean, certainly it's possible, but it appears to be at odds with what is said about someone who is dead in the rest of the New Testament. So likely that is not what Christ is saying here. Um, Very likely what he was saying is that, yeah, the girl is dead, but to the girl and to the observers, it will look as if she has just basically taken a nap. She's just fallen asleep because she's only been dead for, a little bit. I mean, probably a matter of minutes, maybe a little bit longer than that, but I wouldn't say hours because he's walking from the shore to the house. So, she is dead, but to her family and to the girl herself, it will have been as if she just took a small nap. Yes, she is dead, but this is described in as sleep. And I think the other reason why he probably uses this language here is to indicate that her condition wasn't final or irrevocable, right? No, she's not dead. She's just sleeping. Don't worry. She's going to be alive here momentarily. So I think that's the import of that language. All right, I got to get moving here in order to finish this up. Um, now, again, Jesus kicks out all the those who don't exhibit faith, and then he takes the parents, his three disciples, and then he grabs the girl's hand and he speaks the Aramaic words "Talitha kum." Again, this was a command. This was a command to her. Little girl, get up. It wasn't a magic formula. This was a command to him. Little girl, get up. And this is his command to her, showing his authority over death. Now, he is speaking in Aramaic, and likely, the Galileans, as I mentioned here, the Galileans were bilingual. In fact, most people were bilingual. They knew Aramaic, they knew Greek, some might have known Latin, but many of the Jews also knew Hebrew. So it's likely that Jesus was at least, was proficient in three languages, right? Aramaic, Greek, and Hebrew. But this is a word spoken by him are Aramaic. They are not Hebrew words, right? So that's what he says. And then again, notice that at his command, immediately the girl gets up and begin walking around, right? So we've got the woman with the issue of blood immediately healed. Jesus immediately realizes that the healing has occurred. And here at the command, she immediately gets up as well. So you see this immediate throughout this particular context here. Now, the disciples and the parents, it says that they were completely astonished. The word there in the Greek is existemi, which means, out of your mind. I mean, it's literally like, the whole thing with kids do, they go like, mind blown. I mean, this is exactly what it is. Like they're literally like, almost freaking out in amazement because of what they have just seen. Um, and so that's kind of their state, which is the right state for them to be in. They recognize exactly who Jesus is and what he's done. Now he gives two orders. The first one is they are not to tell anybody about what has happened. It's a very, very strict language Jesus used. They are not to tell anybody about what has gone on. And again, we talked about the reason for that is because of his new policy following the unpardonable sin. The second command, though, was that the girl be given some food. So this again shows his compassion. He didn't want to just restore her to life, but he wanted to restore her to health, right? not just life, but to health. And likely she had been struggling with something for a while, to the point where maybe she had been malnourished, couldn't eat, so that when she's brought back to life, having food brought to her is an important part of getting her to full and complete health. Now, the interesting thing about this is that what we see here is in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, the great chapter on the resurrection. You know what? Jesus is talked about as being the first fruits for believers. So prior to the resurrection of Christ, there were other people that were resurrected, but all those people that are resurrected are still subject to death. They will still die at a later time. Lazarus still died at a later time. This girl grew up and still died at a later time. And when you read First Corinthians, and I talked about this last week, the death of Christ and the resurrection of Christ are both necessary, but they're necessary for two different reasons. The death of Christ was necessary to pay the price required for sin to be removed and for us to not be condemned to death. And his resurrection was important because it's the first fruits. It's the only means by which we will then have eternal life. And so when you see resurrection, go back to First Corinthians and it'll kind of show you the difference between someone who Jesus resurrects temporarily versus him being the first fruits for all of us that will eventually have eternal life. And then it finally, the section ends with the fact that even though Jesus commands them not to tell anybody, the fact is everybody knew the girl had died, right? And they see her now walking around, and so the fame of Jesus continues to grow throughout the region. So that is the section for tonight. It really wraps up these kind of three, I'll call them massive miracles that happen immediately after his rejection, but they all demonstrate his power either over the demonic world or over disease and life itself, in his ability to bring others back to life and to restore them. So with that, let me stop and let me ask if there are any questions about what we've covered tonight. Or any comments?
Hey, Randall.
Hey, Rich,
Randall,
how are you, man?
I'm good, thanks.
Good.
That was quite a bit that that you
Should
took a that you took us through. Um, these curses that I mean, these afflictions that women had when it came to bleeding that you took us through,
Mhm.
were those considered to be a curse?
It's a good question. I don't know. Obviously, barrenness was considered a curse, right? That was considered a curse, and usually a curse by God on the individual. So, you have, like Sarah, she's basically, cursed and things like that. But I don't really know. I don't know, Rich. I
And then
do
the other,
know that she was a social outcast. I can tell you that.
well, and then there's the thing about a woman uh, bleeding. It does not seem to. I mean, you're talking about some very obvious differences between men and women, but that the woman bleeds and the man does not, um, and the fact that she bleeds is considered to be unclean. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah. According to Leviticus. So Leviticus, now again, remember, ceremonially to be ceremonially unclean does not mean a person has sinned. So back in the Mosaic Law, there were things that you could do that would make you ceremonially unclean. You couldn't either touch somebody else for a little bit, or you had to do certain things to become clean again, or you couldn't participate in the tabernacle rituals and things like that until you became clean. So there's certain things that were not related to sin at all that would make you ceremonially unclean.
I
The
see.
you know a woman's monthly menstrual cycle, would make her unclean. Um, you know, from a man's perspective, seminal emission would make him, unclean, right? So there's certain things that would make you ceremonially unclean that have nothing to do with whether or not the person has committed a sin, right? So I just want to make sure that that's really clear. But unfortunately for this woman, the bleeding doesn't stop. You don't have a small period of time where you're ceremonially unclean. You're ceremonially unclean the whole time. So there's no reprieve from that issue, and of course that creates all these problems.
Anyway, I love I love what you said about her faith. I thought that was really encouraging.
She had a lot of faith. Like I said, just to think you could touch the clothing
Just a
and
little bit, just
heal.
right, just to touch
Correct.
in a
Again, it
crowd.
reminded me very much of the centurion, where it's like, look, you don't have to come, Jesus. You stay right there. Just say the word and it'll be done. Right? That type of faith. Correct. All right. Any other questions, comments?
Man, man,
You
Is that
alive,
you,
Jeff?
Jeff? Is that Jeff?
yeah.
No. You alive, Jeff?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Oh, you can hear me. Oh, good.
Yeah.
Just been listening, man, on my phone and as I was driving and doing other stuff. But I gotta tell you, when when you were describing the woman who reached out and touched his garment, just touched his garment, and then he makes her known to his disciples. It's like, and he said something to the effect of, Jesus knows, he knows where you're at. And he knows what you need. God, I had to stop and sit down because the tears just started rolling, man. It just hit me. He knows where you are at relationally with him, and he knows what you need. And I wish I'm gonna have to watch that part again to write down what you said. I wasn't able to take the notes, but it just hit me what a lovely, giving, knowing Savior we have. He's there for us if we have the faith to allow him to be there for us.
Yeah. I think it's, I mean, to be honest with you, I think this one of the things is that story illustrates is exactly that um he was able to distinguish all the other touching, and he was being touched by everybody from the one person that actually needed to be touched by him, that needed to
Yeah.
touch him. And that's just how he is, right? And so yeah, I think there is a real application to each one of us. He knows exactly what you need, who needs it tonight, and he's there to meet that.
Mm. We just, and these are the things that we go through our day, and just so many things go over our head, and we're not paying attention. But these moments, those qualities, the relationship that we can have with our Father, if we want to have the same relationship that He wants to have with us, it stops me in my tracks, and
Mhm.
frankly embarrasses me for not pursuing Him the way that He has made Himself available to us.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Jeff.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Any other comments, questions? All right. Well, thank you everyone for tonight, and we'll see you next week. Hopefully, there's no snow, and we'll be back in person. But yeah, I appreciate it.
Thank you,
I
Randy.
hope it snows. I hope it snows a ton. But thanks anyway.
Okay. All
Good
right.
night.
See you, everyone.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.